Roundtable. So the Maharashtra Environment Minister setting the debate. Let's widen it now. Joining me now on the Climate Change Roundtable, Naveen Munjal, Managing Director at Hero Electric Vehicles, R.R. Rashmi, Distinguished Fellow at TERI, Sunita Narayan, Director General, Center for Science and Environment, and Ulka Kelkar, Director Climate Program, World Resources Institute. Appreciate all of you joining us. I want to first get y'all to tell us and our viewers how you see this climate emergency as we are describing it. Sunita Narayan, if a viewer was to ask you, Sunita Narayan, what should I understand by a climate emergency? What would you tell them?
Rajdeep, things are bad. Climate change is going to get worse. We are already seeing extreme weather events hit all parts of the world. Country like India is even more vulnerable because we have very large numbers of very poor people who live at the margins of survival. Also, remember, for us, climate change is not the only cause of the devastation. It's always a double whammy. So when you get a cloudburst in the Himalayas, it is extremely devastating, and we've already seen the kind of loss of lives that we've had in Kerala, in Uttarakhand, in Darjeeling, just in the last 15 days. But this is on top of the mismanagement that we are doing of our own environment. So for us, climate change is bad. For the world, climate change is bad. And the point that we need to keep remembering is that the emissions that cause climate change are still linked to the way the world understands growth. So when you're talking about climate change, Rajdeep, you are not talking about a problem of ecology only. You're talking about a problem of economy. And given the fact that we have a finite space, a budget, as you may call it, beyond which you will see a temperature rise, you're talking about sharing that budget between countries of the world. So which is what makes climate change that much more difficult.
Ulka Kelkar, how do you see this climate emergency? What is, according to you, the immediate impact for India in particular?
I think the immediate impact for India includes that of heat stress, as well as the kinds of disasters that Sunita spoke about. I think the immediate impact will be felt most by those who don't have air conditioners, air purifiers, and other ways of protecting themselves from these climate hazards. But I also want to say that the immediate impact is being felt even in the Western countries. The US had 18 disasters last year of $1 billion or more. Germany had to put 30 billion euros for just a single flood event. So this is something that is already being felt all over the world in very stark economic terms.
Mr. Rashmi, how do you see it as a distinguished fellow at TERI? How do you see the climate emergency facing the world? How do you see it from an Indian perspective? Why should we be so scared?
Well, Rajdeep, there was a time when there was something called climate skepticism. At least now we are sure that the days of climate skepticism is over. So everyone believes that the climate is in serious crisis and we are being impacted adversely. There are scientific reports by all over the world which have established that the climate crisis is deepening. In a country like India, we have always been exposed to things like climate variability. But and this is not new. I mean, for thousands of years we have been exposed to vagaries of climate, and the Indian people are they are attuned to live up to this, and adjust to this kind of problem. But what has happened in the last few decades is that the intensity of this variability has increased, and the extreme weather events has increased, which has exposed the most vulnerable, the weakest. The constituents of our society, they have been exposed to this the climate crisis. So the adverse impacts have deepened.
The adverse impacts have deepened. As you said, the most vulnerable are perhaps those who live on the margins in society. Naveen Munjal, as Managing Director, Hero Electric, you can give us a corporate perspective. What does a climate emergency mean for corporate India?
Rajdeep, I would like to look at it also from a slightly different perspective, and that is what is happening in our cities and our country in terms of the pollution that's happening. Now, on the onset of winters, at least in North India, we are going to be under a blanket of smog now going forward. Now, that is the smog, COVID, plus the COVID situation that we've got. That's a very deadly combination to have. So while we need to attack it from a climate perspective, we also need to attack it from a pollution and environment perspective. So which means we really need to start cleaning up our cities. We know we've got 12 of the 15 most polluted cities in the world are in India.
Yes.
That's not a good thing to have. So we've got climate on one hand, and we've got pollution and environment on another. And then on the third hand, of course, we've got this pandemic which has been going on. So that's not a great thing for India. That's where we need to really start attacking it from multiple angles. And we need to be very aggressive when it comes down to these factors.
Okay, so since all of you have set the stage in a way for why this is such a major emergency, let's try and look at solutions. Glasgow COP26, there's much talk of possibility of countries coming together and saying, okay, we will bring you net zero carbon emissions by what, 2050 is the buzzword. Sunita Narayan, we keep hearing these words. We heard it in Paris also, that there was this commitment to bring down global temperatures by at least 2 degrees Celsius. We're nowhere close to that. What do you believe what can the world and indeed India do? What are realistic solutions according to you?
Okay, Rajdeep, I think the first thing we need to do is to get out of all these diversionary tactics that the world keeps coming up with. Net zero is completely, I call it a scam. The fact is that nobody has a plan on how they will reach net zero. Net zero means that you can continue to emit. In the future, there will be technologies that will be used to soak up carbon dioxide in forests or by sequestering it underground. This, when we know that the industrialized world has to front load its emissions. We know that they've already appropriated the bulk of the share and they need to do something by 2030. So in my view, there's complete, it's an effort to basically derail and to pinpoint blame somewhere else and do very little at home. So net zero, let's park. The question that you've asked is, what can India do? And I think this is where Mr. Munjal's point, I want to take that forward. I think for India, the strategy has to be based on what we call at CSE co-benefits. It has to be within the framework of saying, we don't have to do anything on climate because we are not responsible for the stock of greenhouse gases. But we must do something on climate change because it is in our best interest. And the way we have to frame it is to say, how can we make sure that we can reduce emissions, pollution in our cities, and at the same time deal with climate change? The simple answer there would be that vehicles and transport are a very major cause of emissions all over the world. We have to start reinventing our mobility system. Then we know coal is a very major part of the problem. 40% of the emissions of greenhouse gases come from coal and industries that burn coal. We clearly will remain users of coal, but we need to clean up our coal-based power plants. We need to find a way in which we can make sure that we can electrify our economy so that we can move out of these individual boilers which are very polluting and are destroying our lives. So I think India has to come up with a strategy which is based on our best interests, what I call co-benefits, and then frame them. But we have to do something. We cannot argue only to say, we are not responsible for the problem, so we will not do something, because it is in our best interest to act because of local reasons.
Mr. Munjal, as someone who heads an electric vehicle company, do you believe transport is just one of the various challenges that lies ahead? Is industry itself in general willing to embrace clean energy? Is it willing to sort of embrace new technologies that ensure minimum carbon emissions?
The industry itself is open to switching. So the industry is looking forward to switching, but it's a process. So what you need to have is, what is required is very strong goals by which we really want to convert, and then work backwards from there. And those goals should not be too far off. They shouldn't be a 2050 goal, for example. That's almost 30 years out. 30 years out is way too long. So we need to have smaller goals, closer goals, and achievable goals. And we need to have measures by which we are really measuring whether we are able to achieve those goals or not.
What's the goal, for example, for your industry? Since you're in electric vehicle, what's the goal for 2030?
So there is a discussion which has been going on about a 30% conversion, which I think is too lax at this point of time. Now, while that is the case, we need to break it up into different segments: two-wheelers, three-wheelers, cars, public transport, commercial vehicles. All of them should not be put in the same basket. So different baskets, different goals for different baskets. Two-wheelers probably could happen much faster because of infrastructure requirements. Cars may take longer. Commercial vehicles would take even longer because, again, we don't have infrastructure for that at this point of time. And public transport may happen faster. So we need to set different goals for different segments.
Different goals for different segments. Mr. Rashmi, what are the specific goals do you think that India should be setting itself for 2030?
Well, 2030 goals are already enshrined in the NDC. But the issue is the 2050 goal. I mean, the 2050 goal is being juxtaposed against the 2030 goal as if 2050 is much more important than 2030. So the question is, the goalpost itself is being shifted. So we need to see this in two separate boxes. If 2050 net zero goal is to be achieved, and I'm sure, I think it's a laudable goal at the global level, and we must have a plan for that. Unfortunately, that is what is missing. The pathway.
No, is it a laudable goal? Sorry to intervene. Is it a laudable goal or is it an unrealistic goal? Do you really believe that we can reach zero net carbon emissions?
No. Achievement and achievability I'm not discussing that. I'm saying that the people who are espousing this net zero goal, it might be a laudable goal for them. And at the global level, we need to talk about decarbonization. But the point is that if you look at the trend of the global emissions, in 2030, the UNFCCC Secretariat has said that compared to 2020, there will be 10% increase in the global emissions. So if we can't reverse the trend in the global emissions by 2030, how is the world going to reach net zero by 2050? So this is obviously a sham, as Sunita has said. So we need to focus on 2030 goals, and those people who are advocating a net zero goal by 2050, they need to advance this net zero goal proportionately as required by science to 2030. The science says 45% reduction compared to 2010 level, and the current NDCs are only 10% of that. Not even much less than that. So India, and as far as India is concerned, it has already put out a very ambitious NDC. It's progressing very well on all three counts of its NDC. So I don't think India can be asked to do much more. Of course, there is room for improvement, but that depends on a globally cooperative framework which is evolved by the British presidency.
So in a way, these goals which are set will constantly keep changing. Ulka Kelkar, do you believe the goals to be set by the Western world are very different to what India sets for itself in the next 10 years?
I don't think so, and I also disagree a little bit with what Sunita and Mr. Rashmi said. Climate change is a global problem, and if we all agreed, as we did in the beginning of this segment, that we're in a climate emergency, then we need to act together to prevent this emergency, to ameliorate it. With the kinds of plans that all countries, including India, have already announced, we're actually quite close to reaching 2 degrees Celsius of warming, provided we implement those plans, provided we stick to those plans. And as far as India's goals are concerned, the NDCs that Mr. Rashmi spoke about, we've actually almost already achieved them. So it means we can do better. And so what would this kind of, this net zero, what would it look like in practical terms, the way Mr. Munjal put it? It would mean that in 2050, almost all our electricity will come from the sun, from the wind, and from rivers. Almost all our vehicles will be electric. It will mean that, that we will save millions of premature deaths due to air pollution. And it will mean new things, like, for example, industry using millions of tons of green hydrogen instead of coal, oil, and gas. The important thing to remember is that technology prices fall far more dramatically than we can predict, provided we have the right policies and these early and decisive action that can make sure that we have scale economies that drive down prices. Of course, we have to do this sensibly. We have to make sure that we take care of nature, of land, of minerals, and of especially the way we urbanize. But I think it's definitely something to aspire for.
Just for our viewers, NDC, which our guests have been repeatedly referring to, refer to nationally determined contributions, the commitments that were made in 2015 by each country. India claims we've done more than most. But before I come back to you all to get more solutions, let's listen into Bill Gates, co-founder at Microsoft. I spoke to him at the India Today conclave a few weeks ago, and this was precisely the challenge before him as well, since he is now obsessively looking at climate change. Is the West really committed to net zero carbon emissions? Take a look at what Bill Gates said. You've been speaking about the need for zero emissions at a time when we need to decarbonize, according to you, 70% of the world economy. That sounds daunting in a way. How do you sort of impact on scale? Which area do you zero down on and why, so that you can impact on a scale of the kind that you're talking about?
Yeah, zero's a very tough goal because it means we can't just take passenger cars. We have to do planes and trains and trucks. We can't just do industry, steel and cement. We can't just do agriculture or heating buildings or making electricity. We have to do every one of those areas. And today, the cost of the green product to make steel or cement with no emissions is over double the current price. And so the cost to go green is simply unacceptable, even for the rich countries, not to mention middle-income countries like India. And so the path to salvation is huge innovations, including things like clean hydrogen or direct air capture or scaling up electric cars and electric trucks to a super high level to take over the way we presently do every one of those activities.
You've taken from my next question, Bill Gates, because apart from striving for clean energy, what are those 3 to 4 innovations that you see, or 3 to 5 areas where you can have maximum innovation for real opportunity? You spoke about electric cars, for example. What are those areas that a country like India in particular you see going forward, where we can actually make a difference and impact on scale again?
Yeah, so it's great that electric cars are starting to catch on. It's still a very small percentage of the market, but as those batteries become cheaper for cars of all sizes, they will become popular, and the government will push them with tax credits and encourage the market to shift. Likewise, for making electricity, the cost of wind and solar has come down. And so India's also installing large amounts of solar. And so those are 2 areas of progress that scaling is very, very hard, even in the next 30 years, to get rid of all the emissions there. The other sectors, though, if I had a magic wand, I'd say we need something to solve the industrial sector. The thing we talk about the most there is this hydrogen, clean hydrogen or green hydrogen, that if it was cheap enough, we would use that instead of hydrocarbons to make things like steel or natural gas. And there's lots of good ideas. Breakthrough Energy, my group, that includes a lot of partners, including Mukesh Ambani is one of the investors and board members in that. We're investing in a lot of companies who have new ideas about doing that cheap hydrogen. And then the big companies are now looking, okay, how far are they going? Should we partner with them and do this with big numbers? So that's at an early stage, but that would be a huge thing. You probably need 10 areas of innovation, and so we have to. That's where the R&D budget is the beginning here, and lots of risk capital. But only 2 or 3 inventions won't solve the entire problem and enable all countries, not just rich countries, all countries to get to zero.
Sunita Narayan, we come back then to the financing of this. All of the, there is a lot of worry that we in India, people at the margins have, as well as some smaller corporates have, is that it's not going to be easy for us to follow the kind of climate norms that are likely to be put in over the next decade. How fair is that? The financing has to come from the wealthier nations of the world.
Absolutely, Rajdeep. I think, the fact is, as I began to say, climate change is a very inconvenient truth because it is about a gas which has a very long life in the atmosphere. So once you emit it, it stays for 150 to 200 years, which means what you do in the past matters for the future. Now, this is why when the package of change was agreed in 1992, it was agreed that was the Framework Convention on Climate Change. There was a very clear principle. The principle was there were countries which had emitted, and there were 7 countries, or the OECD countries, 70% of the emissions came from those countries. And it was agreed that they would take first action to cut. And that would create space for the remaining countries to grow. But so that those remaining countries would grow differently, money and finance and technology would be provided, which would enable a different growth. I mean, Ulka is talking about hydrogen, all the other wonderful things that can happen to reinvent our economy without pollution, but they will cost. And that is why the Western world, in spite of all the preaching that it's doing on climate change, UK is turning back its coal-based power plants today because the gas prices have gone up. So the light bulbs in Glasgow are going to be fueled by coal, in spite of all the talk about climate change. So finance is critical. What has come out very clearly is that there is $100 billion that was promised by 2020. The contest is not just about the volume of money. The contest is about how you will measure it. And it's very interesting, again, that the Western world, which tells us about transparency, verification, measurement, there is no tool to measure what money comes in the name of climate change. So OECD says that they are already close to the 100 billion mark. In fact, the group of ministers right now is fighting in Rome because the statement that they want to give out is to say, the group of 20 ministers, to say that we are close to the goal. However, an organization like Oxfam, which put together a very detailed report on how they had accounted for it, found that even projects that were loans, projects that came as commercial finance, projects that came for building roads was put in climate finance. So I think it's very important for the world to get real about the principle of equity and climate justice if we have to move ahead, not just in the interests of a country like India, but in the interests of the world.
It's a word that, of course, the Minister for Environment has used, Bhupendra Yadav, before he left for Glasgow. But Ulka Kelkar, it's also China. China remains also, in a way, the elephant in the room. We don't know whether China will fulfill its commitments by 2030. Therefore, sometimes I hear Indian policy makers saying, look, we are going to have to wait to see what the rest of the world does also before pushing ourselves. Is that the attitude to take, or should India here stand on its own and say, look, we have certain commitments, we are going to follow them, let the rest of the world do what they have to do?
I think we actually have, I would say, a 20-year head start over China. We are at a point in our development pathway where 20 years from now, 60% of emissions will come from things that have not yet been built. Power plants that have not yet been built, buildings that have not yet been constructed, appliances that have not been purchased, vehicles that are not yet on the road. So we could even think of it as we are at a position right now to choose a low carbon pathway, a greener pathway to development. So it really doesn't matter what other countries are doing to us and to our choices. Of course, it matters in terms of the climate emergency that we spoke about. The thing is, for a lot of the Western countries, their emissions are, ranging from the past. With China, it's the last 20 years and going forward. With us, our emissions still lie in the future. We can avoid them. We don't have to follow the same path, the same dirty, polluting path that the industrial countries have taken.
So let me in conclusion ask all four of you, if you were today to offer a pathway for a clear solution, and there are no quick fix silver bullets out there, it's going to be a hard process that you will have to follow over the years. Let's go right round the table and ask you for the one or two solutions that you would like to see immediately done that suggest a growing commitment to climate change. Mr. Rashmi, why don't you start off? If you had one or two commitments that you would like to see right away.
You see, India's the ambition is already given out in the NDC, and India has done very well as far as energy transition is concerned. In the power sector, we are doing extremely well. But the emissions intensity is falling largely because of power sector, largely because of energy efficiency. But the days will come very soon when the carbon intensity will hit a wall. It will not go down. So we'll need to do something immediately in the sectors which are deeply carbon intensive, like transport, steel, cement, and fertilizers. And that is where the action, the real action needs to be taken. And that requires finance and technology. So what are the transformative technologies which we can apply in this industrial sector for industrial decarbonization? That should be the priority. Now, what are the policy choices there? That needs a separate discussion altogether.
Naveen Munjal, I come back to it from an industry perspective. What are the commitments that you would like to see? Do you believe that the technologies are being put in place for us to be in a better place 10 years from now than we are today?
Certainly. So there is a substantial push which is already there by the government. You know, when you look at our various policies that we've got in place, we've got the FAME 2, which was set in place into motion in 2019 and has been amended this year. So that's become a very good policy. Besides that, there are a number of states also which are pushing this whole electric mobility through. So when I talk about it from a transportation sector, so there is a lot of push which is already happening. Now, what is missing or what is required to be done is to set concrete goals in place. And as I was saying in the beginning, and those goals should not be too far off, but yet they should be achievable. So once we set a goal in place, everything in the back starts to happen. So, you know, the supply chains will fall in place,
right.
Reskilling of workforce will fall in place, the dealer network or the sales channels will fall in place. Once we know what those goals are. So we need to establish those goals and different goals for different categories of products.
Sunita Narayan, you know, government itself, which has often been called the biggest polluter, the governments which continue to do deforestation, some of the most pristine forests in my home state of Goa, for example, are now being destroyed because railroads are being built. I mean, what are the commitments that you would like to see beyond the fine talk that we keep hearing from time to time?
So, Rajdeep, let me make it very clear that if you take India's commitments, as Mr. Rashmi has said, in terms of our contribution to the problem, we are doing okay. But that's basically saying we're doing nothing because we don't have to do anything. In my view, as I said, we need to put it within a co-benefit agenda. We need to take action on climate because it's in our interest. So let me give you two things, one at the India level and one at the global level, which I think are critical. Yeah. At the India level, I think the Indian government must clean up its thermal power sector. Thermal power sector is a very major contributor both to local air pollution as well as climate change GHG emissions. And we know today that the Indian government has actually delayed the implementation of the thermal power sector norms. CSE has been working very hard to push for clean coal. It's an oxymoron, but even then, given India's reality, we understand that we need to clean up our thermal power sector. So
and the global solution?
And the global solution for me, the biggest issue is loss and damage. In Paris, the world came together and said that we will not take loss and damage as an issue of compensation or liability, which means that the polluters would not pay for the damage that you are showing on your screen, the horrendous damage because of climate change. And this is when scientists can today attribute every single extreme event to how much is the impact from climate change. Right. So I think global solution has to be to put loss and damage on the table and get the polluters to pay.
You know, it's interesting that you refer to thermal power stations because some of these power stations, the deforestation that's taking place is to allow raw material to be sent to these very power stations. And that's the concern that many of us have, that you're going to have to actually walk the talk now. Very quickly, Ulka, your one quick solution?
Two quick solutions. One, from transport, it is not cars or planes that will have the growing bulk of emissions. It will be road trucks. So we need to shift tail. And second, as we build our cities, energy infrastructure, transport infrastructure, we need to protect trees, mangroves, and grasslands.
I think that's that's a fine way on which we can perhaps sort of conclude this roundtable. There are lots of solutions out there. What they need is will. And I think they need at least an increase in the knowledge about the scale of the problem and people to appreciate just why climate change is perhaps one of the biggest issues, if not the biggest issue, confronting mankind in the 21st century. I appreciate 4 fine voices for joining us and shedding more light than heat. That's the good thing about not having politicians on the show. Okay, I'm going to leave you now with images that perhaps will scare you, but that's not the intention, because these are real. This is a real climate emergency that the world faces, and the world must come together to ensure